You see me here today, a 76-year-old woman with silver hair and hands that tell stories of decades lived, but you cannot imagine the secret I've carried for over 40 years. There are wounds that time softens but never fully heals, and truths so devastating they reshape everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. My name is Patricia, and what I'm about to share with you happened in 1982, in a small industrial town called Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Back then, I was a 32-year-old newlywed, believing I had found my fairy tale ending. But sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones who shatter our world into pieces so small, we think we'll never put them back together again. Before I begin this journey with you, I need you to understand something. This isn't just my story. It's the story of countless women who have suffered in silence, who have been betrayed not just by their abusers, but by the very systems and people meant to protect them. And most importantly, it's a story about what happens when the person you love most does something so unthinkable, it changes the course of your entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Patricia Ann Morrison in 1950, in the small farming community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. My childhood was what most people would call picture perfect. White picket fence, Sunday church services, family dinners around a wooden table that my grandfather had built with his own hands. My father, William Morrison, owned the local hardware store, and my mother, Dorothy, was the town's most sought-after piano teacher. We weren't wealthy, but we were respected, and in a town of barely 3,000 people, that meant everything. Growing. Up in the 1950s and 60s, expectations for young women were crystal clear. Be polite, be pretty, get married, have children, and support your husband's dreams while quietly setting aside your own. I was taught that a woman's greatest achievement was becoming a wife and mother. Education was nice, but it was really just something to fall back on, just in case, though no one ever elaborated on what that just in case might be. I was always the responsible one, the daughter who never caused trouble. While other girls my age were experimenting with rebellion, listening to rock music, wearing shorter skirts, questioning authority. I was helping my mother with church fundraisers and studying for my teaching certificate. I graduated valedictorian from Cedar Rapids High School in 1968, and my parents beamed with pride as I walked across that stage. Their perfect daughter was ready to make them proud in all the ways that mattered. College was a compromise. My parents agreed to let me attend Iowa State University for my teaching degree, but with strict conditions. I would live in the approved dormitory, maintain perfect grades, and come home every weekend. No dating without their approval, no staying out past 10 p.m., and absolutely no radical ideas that might taint my Christian upbringing. I followed every rule to the letter, terrified of disappointing the two people whose approval meant everything to me. It was during my junior year, in the fall of 1970, that everything changed. I was working part-time at the university library, shelving books and helping students with research, when I first saw him. David Mitchell was a graduate student in mechanical engineering, tall and lanky with dark hair that always seemed slightly disheveled from running his hands through it when he was deep in thought. He had a quiet intensity about him, the kind of focused determination that made professors take notice, and fellow students either admire or envy him. David was different from the boys I'd grown up with in Cedar Rapids. He read philosophy books. For pleasure, questioned everything from political systems to religious doctrine, and had dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of small-town Iowa. He wanted to design machines that would revolutionize manufacturing, to create innovations that would improve people's lives. When he talked about his future, his eyes lit up with a passion I'd never seen before. Our courtship was slow and careful. David respected my parents' rules, always bringing me back to the dormitory before curfew, asking permission before taking me anywhere, and enduring awkward Sunday dinners with my family whenever he visited Cedar Rapids. My father was initially suspicious. David's own background was quite different from ours. He came from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from a family that had built wealth through steel manufacturing. His father, Robert Mitchell, owned Mitchell Steel Works, one of the largest independent steel companies in the region. But David's respectful demeanor and obvious devotion to me gradually won my parents over. More importantly, his family's financial stability impressed them. Here was a young man who could provide for their daughter in ways that few others could. When David graduated with his master's degree in mechanical engineering and immediately received a position at his father's company, my parents saw it as divine providence. The proposal came in the spring of 1972 during my senior year. David had planned everything meticulously: a picnic by the lake where we'd had our first real conversation, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and words that made me feel like I was living in one of the romance novels I secretly read when my parents weren't watching. "Patricia," he said, his voice trembling slightly with nerves, "you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. You're brilliant, kind, and beautiful, and I can't imagine spending my life with anyone else. Will you marry me?" I said yes without hesitation. At 22, I felt like I was stepping into the life I'd always been told I should want. David was everything my parents had hoped for in a son-in-law: educated, ambitious, from a good family, and completely devoted to me. The engagement period was blissful. I finished my teaching degree while David worked in Pittsburgh, and we spent weekends planning our future together. Our wedding was set for June 1973, and as that date approached, I felt nothing but excitement and anticipation. David had found us a beautiful house in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a charming town about 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh. It was a colonial-style home with 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a garden that I immediately envisioned filling with flowers and vegetables. The house was in a neighborhood where other young professionals lived: doctors, lawyers, engineers like David, and it felt like the perfect place to start our married life. The wedding itself was everything a small-town girl could dream of. The church in Cedar Rapids was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, and what seemed like the entire town turned out to celebrate. My dress was ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves, passed down from my grandmother and altered to fit perfectly. David looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his eyes never leaving mine as I walked down the aisle on my father's arm. But it was during the wedding reception that I first met Robert Mitchell properly, beyond the brief introductions that had happened during our engagement. David's father was an imposing man in his early 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively step aside when he entered a room. He was broader than David, with hands that spoke of years working with machinery before he'd moved into management. When he smiled, which he did often that day, his teeth were perfectly straight and white, but there was something about his eyes that didn't quite match the warmth of his expression. "Welcome to the family, Patricia," he said, taking my hand in both of his during the receiving line. His grip was firm, almost too firm, and he held on just a moment longer than felt comfortable. "David has told me so much about you. He's a lucky man, a very lucky man indeed." At the time, I attributed my slight discomfort to wedding day nerves. Robert Mitchell was, after all, a successful businessman, someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. His intensity was probably just the way powerful men carried themselves. David clearly adored his father, speaking of him with a mixture of respect and affection that made me want to earn Robert's approval as well. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Europe, London, Paris, and Rome, a gift from Robert that was more generous than anything my family could have ever afforded. David and I wandered through museums, ate at cafes, and talked for hours about our plans and dreams. I felt sophisticated and worldly, this small-town girl who was now married to a brilliant engineer and living a life that seemed straight out of a movie. When we returned to Millbrook and settled into our new home, I threw myself into the role of wife with the same dedication I'd always brought to everything else. I decorated our house, learned to cook David's favorite meals, and began the process of making friends in our new community. David's work at Mitchell Steelworks was demanding, often requiring 12-hour days and occasional travel, but he always came home excited to tell me about new projects and innovations. Life felt perfect in those early months. We hosted dinner parties for David's colleagues, attended company social events, and began talking seriously about starting a family. I had taken a position teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary School, and I loved working with the children. But both David and I knew that when babies came, I would likely stop working to focus on raising our family. It was at the company Christmas party in December 1973, 6 months after our wedding, that I began to notice something that made me uncomfortable. The party was held at the country club, a lavish affair with an open bar, live music, and dancing. I wore a navy blue dress that David had bought for me, something more elegant than anything I'd owned before our marriage, and I felt beautiful and confident as we mingled with his colleagues and their wives. Robert Mitchell was naturally the center of attention. As the company owner, he moved through the crowd like a gracious host, shaking hands, making jokes, and ensuring everyone felt welcome. But I began to notice how his interactions with women, both employees and wives, had a particular quality that made me shift uncomfortably. His compliments lingered too long, his hand on his shoulder stayed in place when it should have moved away, and his eyes had a way of traveling that felt invasive rather than admiring. When he asked me to dance, I couldn't refuse without seeming rude. David was deep in conversation with another engineer about some technical problem they were solving, and declining would have been a social misstep that could affect David's position in the company. So I smiled and accepted Robert's outstretched hand, allowing him to lead me onto the dance floor. "You look absolutely stunning tonight, Patricia," he said as we moved to the slow music. "That dress, it suits you perfectly. David is a very fortunate man." His hand on my waist felt too low, too familiar, and when I tried to adjust our position slightly, he maintained his grip. "You're very kind, Mr. Mitchell," I replied, trying to keep my voice light and pleasant while creating more space between us. "Please call me Robert," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for me to hear. "We're family now, after all, and family should be close." The way he said that last word sent a chill down my spine that I couldn't quite explain. When the song ended, I excused myself quickly, claiming I needed to freshen up, and spent several minutes in the ladies' room trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in my stomach. I told myself I was overreacting. Robert Mitchell was a powerful, successful man who was probably just being friendly in his own way. Different people had different social styles, and what felt inappropriate to me might simply be the way he interacted with everyone. After all, David loved and respected his father deeply, and David was one of the most honorable men I'd ever known. Surely, if there was something wrong with Robert's behavior, David would have noticed it long before I did. But as the winter months passed and we continued to attend company events and family gatherings, I began to notice patterns that I could no longer dismiss as my imagination. Robert's compliments to me were always just a little too personal. His touches always lasted just a moment too long, and his eyes had a way of finding me across crowded rooms that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. The worst part was that these interactions always happened when David was distracted or engaged elsewhere. Robert seemed to have an uncanny ability to approach me when I was alone, when David was getting drinks, or talking business, or helping his stepmother Eleanor in the kitchen. It was as if he was deliberately timing these moments, waiting for opportunities when his behavior couldn't be witnessed or questioned. By spring of 1974, I had developed a subtle but persistent anxiety whenever I knew we would be seeing Robert. I found myself making excuses to avoid certain family gatherings, claiming headaches or work obligations that weren't entirely true. When those excuses didn't work, I tried to position myself strategically at events, staying close to David or other people, never allowing myself to be isolated where Robert might approach me. But avoidance could only work for so long. David's birthday was in May, and Eleanor had planned a family celebration at their house, a large, impressive property on the outskirts of Pittsburgh that reflected the Mitchell family's wealth and status. The house itself was intimidating, with high ceilings, expensive artwork, and rooms that seemed designed more for impressing guests than for comfortable family living. As we drove there that Saturday afternoon, David was excited and relaxed, talking about his work and some new projects that Robert was considering. "Dad's been really impressed with my contributions this year," he said, his pride evident in his voice. "He told me yesterday that he's thinking about promoting me to department head. Can you believe it? Just over a year out of college and already moving up in the company." I smiled and made appropriate, encouraging responses, but my stomach was tight with apprehension. Something about the way Robert looked at me, the way he found excuses to touch my hand or shoulder, the way his compliments always had an undertone that made me uncomfortable. It was escalating, and I didn't know how to address it without seeming paranoid or ungrateful. The birthday celebration started pleasantly enough. Eleanor had prepared a lovely dinner, and we sat around their formal dining room table talking about David's work, my teaching, and various family news. Robert was charming and attentive, the perfect host and father, and I began to think that maybe I had been overreacting to his previous behavior. But after dinner, when Eleanor suggested we move to the living room for coffee and cake, Robert announced that he wanted to show David some new equipment catalogs in his study. "Business never stops," he said with a laugh. "But this will only take a few minutes. Patricia, make yourself comfortable. Eleanor will take good care of you." Except that Eleanor, it turned out, had developed a sudden headache and excused herself to rest upstairs, leaving me alone in the large living room with its uncomfortable formal furniture and imposing family portraits. I sat quietly, looking through a magazine and waiting for David to finish his business discussion with his father. That's when it happened, the moment that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. Robert returned alone, explaining that David had gotten fascinated by some technical specifications and would be occupied for a while longer. "You know how he gets when he's focused on engineering problems," Robert said with an indulgent smile. He could be in there. For an hour, he sat down on the sofa next to me, closer than the large piece of furniture required, and his presence immediately made the spacious room feel cramped and airless. "I've been wanting to talk to you alone, Patricia," he said, his voice taking on that tone I'd begun to recognize and dread. "There are things a man can't say in front of his son." What followed was the most uncomfortable 15 minutes of my life up to that point. Robert told me how beautiful I was, how lucky David was to have me, and how he hoped I understood how important family loyalty was to the Mitchell name. But underneath those seemingly innocent words was something else entirely, a suggestion that there were ways I could show my appreciation for the family's generosity, ways I could ensure David's continued success in the company. He never said anything explicitly inappropriate. He was too smart, too careful for that. But his meaning was clear in the way he looked at me, in the way he moved closer on the sofa, in the way his hand found reasons to touch mine. When I tried to move away, he simply smiled and continued talking as if nothing had happened. I was rescued by David's return, though he noticed nothing amiss. Robert immediately shifted back to his role as the devoted father and gracious host, and I tried to act normal despite the way my heart was racing and my hands were trembling. We left soon after, and I spent the entire drive home trying to convince myself that I had misunderstood the situation. But deep down, I knew I hadn't misunderstood anything. Robert Mitchell had just shown me a side of himself that he kept carefully hidden from his son, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do with that knowledge. How do you tell your husband that his beloved father had just made you feel threatened and uncomfortable in ways you couldn't quite articulate? How do you explain that feeling without concrete evidence, without explicit words that couldn't be Denied? Or reinterpreted? That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how my perfect life had suddenly become so complicated. I had been married for less than a year, and already I was keeping secrets from my husband, secrets that felt too dangerous to share and too important to ignore. I had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning, that Robert Mitchell's behavior would escalate in ways that would test every belief I had about family, loyalty, and the people we trust most. I couldn't have imagined that within months, I would be facing choices that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about right and wrong, about protecting myself and protecting the people I loved. All I knew that night was that something had shifted, something had changed in the careful balance of my new life, and I had no idea how to restore the sense of safety and happiness I had felt just hours before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The summer of 1974 brought changes that seemed positive on the surface, but created new opportunities for Robert's increasingly bold behavior. David received the promotion his father had hinted at, becoming the youngest department head in Mitchell Steelworks history. With this new position came greater responsibilities, longer hours, and frequent business trips to oversee projects at client sites across the Midwest. I should have been thrilled about David's success. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, allowing us to renovate our house and start seriously planning for the family we both wanted. David was ecstatic, working with a passion and dedication that made me proud to be his wife. But his new responsibilities meant he was away from home more often, and those absences created exactly what Robert had been waiting for: opportunities. The first incident happened on a Thursday evening in late June. David had left that morning for a 3-day trip to supervise the installation of new equipment at a factory in Detroit. I was grading final exams from my 3rd grade class when the doorbell rang at 8:30 p.m. Through the peephole, I saw Robert standing on our front porch, holding a bottle of wine and wearing that charming smile that I'd learned to distrust. "Patricia, dear," he said when I opened the door, "I hope you don't mind the impromptu visit. Eleanor is visiting her sister in Baltimore, and I found myself with a bottle of excellent wine and no one to share it with. I thought you might appreciate some company while David's away." Every instinct told me not to let him in, but how do you refuse your father-in-law's seemingly innocent gesture without appearing rude or paranoid? This was 1974, in a small town where family relationships were sacred, and questioning an elder's motives was almost unthinkable. So I stepped aside and allowed him into my home, immediately regretting the decision but unable to see a polite way out. Robert made himself comfortable in our living room, opening the wine and pouring 2 glasses despite my protests that I rarely drank alcohol. "Come now, Patricia," he said, patting the cushion next to him on our sofa. "It's been a long day for both of us. This will help you relax." What followed was 2 hours of the most psychologically exhausting conversation of my life. Robert was a master manipulator, I realized, skilled at creating situations that seemed innocent on the surface, but were actually carefully orchestrated traps. He talked about David's childhood, sharing stories that painted himself as the devoted, single father who had sacrificed everything for his son after David's mother died in a car accident when David was only 8 years old. "David doesn't remember much about his mother," Robert said, his voice taking on a melancholy tone. "I've been both father and mother to him, which is why our relationship is so special. He tells me everything, Patricia. Everything. We don't keep secrets in the Mitchell family." The implicit threat in those words was unmistakable. Robert was making it clear that David's loyalty lay with him, that any conflict between us would not end in my favor. But he delivered this message while appearing to share intimate family history, making me feel privileged to receive such confidential information. As the evening progressed, Robert's behavior became increasingly inappropriate. He moved closer, to me on the sofa, his leg touching mine. He complimented my appearance in ways that made me uncomfortable, commenting on how my blouse brought out the color of my eyes, how married life seemed to agree with me, how David was lucky to come home to such a beautiful wife every evening. When I tried to create distance between us, Robert would launch into another story about David, effectively trapping me in place because walking away would seem like I wasn't interested in learning about my husband's past. He was brilliant at this psychological manipulation, creating scenarios where any resistance on my part could be reframed as disrespectful or ungrateful. The most disturbing moment came when Robert suggested that I must get lonely during David's business trips. A young woman like you, married to such a driven man, it can't be easy being alone so often, he said, his hand finding my shoulder. If you ever need anything at all, you know you can call me. I'm very good at providing comfort. His hand lingered on my shoulder, his thumb making small circles against my collarbone, and I felt my skin crawl. When I finally found the courage to stand up, claiming I had early meetings the next day and needed to prepare lesson plans, Robert didn't argue. But as he was leaving, he made a comment that haunted me for weeks. You know, Patricia, I've been thinking that you and David should move closer to the family estate. There's a beautiful house just down the road from ours that's coming on the market soon. It would be wonderful to have you nearby. I could help David with his career advancement, and you wouldn't have to be alone so much when he travels. Family should stick together, don't you think? After he left, I double-locked the front door and checked every window in the house. I poured the remaining wine down the kitchen sink and spent the rest of the evening trying to process what had just happened. Robert hadn't done anything I could point to as definitively inappropriate. He hadn't touched me inappropriately or said anything explicitly sexual, but every instinct I had was screaming that I had just been the target of a predator testing his boundaries. When David returned from his trip on Sunday evening, I desperately wanted to tell him about his father's visit. But how could I explain my discomfort without sounding paranoid? Robert had been careful to maintain plausible deniability for every action, every word. If I described the evening to David, it would sound like his father had simply been kind and solicitous, checking on his son's wife while offering family stories and career advice. Instead, I found myself mentioning casually that his father had stopped by with wine, making it sound like a brief, pleasant visit. David's face lit up with pleasure. "That's so thoughtful of him," he said, pulling me into his arms. "He really cares about you, Patricia. I can tell. It means everything to me that my wife and father get along so well." The guilt of deceiving David was almost as painful as the fear Robert had instilled in me. I was keeping secrets from my husband, but the alternative, trying to convince him that his beloved father was a threat, seemed impossible and potentially destructive to our marriage. The pattern Robert had established that evening continued throughout the summer. Whenever David traveled for business, Robert would find reasons to visit me. Sometimes he brought small gifts, flowers from Eleanor's garden, a book he thought I might enjoy, ingredients for a special dinner he wanted to teach me to prepare. Each visit seemed innocent on its own, but together they formed a campaign of psychological warfare that left me constantly on edge. Robert was incredibly smart about his approach. He never stayed too long, never did anything that couldn't be explained as fatherly concern, and always made sure to mention how pleased he was that David had married such a wonderful woman. But underneath this facade of family affection, he was systematically breaking down my boundaries and isolating me from potential support systems. He began making subtle comments about my job at the elementary school, suggesting that perhaps it was time for me to focus on starting a family instead of wasting my talents on other people's children. When I mentioned friendships I was developing with other wives in the neighborhood, Robert would find ways to cast doubt on their motivations or loyalty. "You have to be careful about who you trust, Patricia," he would say. "Some people befriend the Mitchell family wives only because they want something from the company. Most insidiously, Robert began positioning himself as the authority on what David needed and wanted. According to Robert, David was stressed by his new responsibilities and needed a wife who was completely supportive and understanding. David preferred his women quiet and accommodating, Robert claimed. David had always been attracted to traditional wives who prioritized their husbands' careers above their own ambitions. These weren't necessarily lies. David did work hard and appreciate my support. But Robert was taking normal marital dynamics and twisting them into a narrative where my primary value lay in my compliance and availability. He was training me to see myself through David's eyes as Robert interpreted them, making me increasingly self-conscious about every choice I made. The psychological pressure became so intense that I began experiencing physical symptoms. I developed chronic headaches that would start whenever I knew David was traveling and Robert might visit. My appetite disappeared, and I lost weight rapidly enough that David noticed and expressed concern. I had trouble sleeping, lying awake, listening for cars in our driveway or footsteps on our porch. The most frightening aspect was how isolated I felt. Robert had successfully made me doubt my own perceptions while simultaneously convincing me that no one would believe my concerns. Who could I tell? My parents in Iowa would be horrified and probably blame me for somehow encouraging inappropriate attention. The other wives at company events seemed to adore Robert, always commenting on what a devoted father-in-law he was and how lucky I was to have married into such a caring family. Even my colleagues at school wouldn't understand. These were conservative, traditional women who believed that family loyalty was paramount and that wives should handle domestic problems privately. The idea of accusing a respected businessman and community leader of psychological harassment would seem preposterous to them. By August, Robert's visits had become a regular occurrence, happening every time David traveled. Robert had keys to our house, a privilege David had granted him for emergencies, and he began using them to enter without invitation. I would come home from school to find him sitting in our living room, or I would wake up on Saturday mornings to discover him in our kitchen making coffee. "I hope you don't mind," he would always say. "I was worried about you being alone, and I thought you might appreciate some company." These unannounced visits were a new level of violation that left me feeling like a prisoner in my own home. Robert was demonstrating that he could access my private space whenever he chose, that my sense of safety and sanctuary was entirely dependent on his goodwill. The message was clear. He had power over my environment, my daily life, and increasingly, over my emotional well-being. The breaking point came during Labor Day weekend. David had been called away unexpectedly to handle a crisis at a client site in Ohio, leaving me alone for what was supposed to be our first long weekend together in months. I was disappointed but understanding. David's job was demanding, and these emergencies were part of the territory. On Saturday afternoon, I was working in our garden when Robert appeared in our backyard. He claimed he had been checking on the property for security purposes and noticed I was outside. "Such a beautiful day for garden work," he said, but his eyes weren't looking at the flowers I was tending. "You look lovely, Patricia. That sundress is very becoming." What happened next crossed every line Robert had been carefully approaching for months. He moved closer to me, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the pleasant weather. When I stepped backward, I found myself trapped between Robert and the garden shed, with nowhere to retreat. "You know, Patricia," he said, his voice lower and more intense than I'd ever heard it. "I've been very patient, very understanding, but patience has its limits, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about our relationship." His hand reached out and touched my face, his thumb tracing along my jawline in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate. When I tried to pull away, his other hand gripped my arm, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to prevent escape. "David doesn't have to know about our friendship," he continued. "In fact, it would be better if he didn't. But I think you and I both know that there's something special between us, something that goes beyond family relationships. I found my voice and told him firmly to let go of me, but Robert just smiled that cold smile I'd learned to fear. Now, Patricia, there's no need to be dramatic. I'm simply suggesting that we could both benefit from a more intimate understanding. You want David to succeed, don't you? You want him to eventually inherit the company that my grandfather built, that I've spent my life expanding? The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Robert was making it clear that David's future, our future, depended on my cooperation with whatever he had in mind. He released my arm but didn't step back, keeping me trapped against the shed while he outlined a future that made my blood run cold. According to Robert, David's success would depend on family unity and loyalty. Wives who caused problems, who created conflicts within the family structure, could find their husbands' careers stalled or ended entirely. But wives who understood their place, who appreciated the opportunities the Mitchell family provided, could expect continued prosperity and advancement. Think about it, Patricia, he said finally, stepping back and allowing me to escape. Think about what's best for everyone involved. We'll talk again soon. After he left, I sat in our garden and cried until I had no tears left. Robert had finally shown his true intentions, and I could no longer pretend that his behavior was merely inappropriate or misguided. He was systematically grooming me for something that would destroy my marriage, my self-respect, and possibly my entire life, but I still didn't know how to fight back. Robert held all the power, financial, social, and psychological. He controlled David's career, our economic security, and our social standing in the community. Most devastatingly, he controlled David's perception of reality through their close, father-son relationship. That night, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. Instead of finding the courage to tell David the truth about his father, I chose a different path. I decided to try to manage the situation myself, to find ways to avoid Robert while protecting David from the knowledge that would shatter his world. It was a decision born of love and fear in equal measure, but it was also a decision that played directly into Robert's hands. By choosing silence, I was giving him exactly what he wanted: compliance, isolation, and the freedom to escalate his campaign of psychological warfare. I had no idea that Robert Mitchell was far more dangerous than I had imagined, and that my attempts to handle the situation quietly would soon put me in a position where silence was no longer an option. September 1974 marked the beginning of what I would later recognize as Robert's final campaign. Having established that I wouldn't immediately run to David with accusations, he interpreted my silence as weakness rather than the protective love it actually was. What I thought was buying time to find a solution, Robert saw as permission to escalate. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came when David announced that Robert wanted to expand our family involvement in company operations. "Dad thinks it would be beneficial for you to understand more about the business," David explained over dinner one evening, his excitement evident. "He suggested that you start helping with some of the administrative work. Organizing company events, managing correspondence with clients' wives, that sort of thing." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The idea of working directly under Robert's supervision filled me with dread, but I couldn't explain my reluctance without revealing why I was afraid of spending more time around his father. "I already have my teaching position," I said carefully. "I'm not sure I'd have time for additional responsibilities." David's face fell slightly, and I could see that my response had disappointed him. "It wouldn't be full-time," he assured me. "Maybe just a few hours a week, helping Dad with special projects. He specifically requested you, Patricia. He said you have exactly the kind of refinement and intelligence that would represent the Mitchell name well. Time and presence, while simultaneously making it impossible for me to refuse without seeming unsupportive of David's career. If I objected too strongly, David would want to know why I was reluctant to help his father. and I still couldn't find words to explain the situation without sounding paranoid or vindictive. "Of course," I heard myself saying. "If Mr. Mitchell thinks I can be helpful, I'd be honored to contribute." David beamed with pride and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "This is wonderful, Patricia. Dad is really taking you into the family fold. This could be the beginning of something much bigger for both of us." Robert had scheduled my first business meeting for the following Thursday afternoon at his private office in downtown Pittsburgh, separate from the main steel works facility. This office, he explained through David, was where he handled his personal investments and real estate ventures. "It's quieter there," David told me. "You'll be able to focus on the administrative work without the distractions of the factory." The building was an older brownstone in the financial district, elegant but understated. Robert's office occupied the entire third floor, accessible only by a small elevator that required a key to operate. When I arrived that Thursday at 2 p.m., as instructed, Robert was waiting for me in the reception area, dressed in an expensive suit and wearing that predatory smile I'd learned to recognize. "Patricia, darling," he said, taking my coat and hanging it carefully in a closet. "How lovely you look today. That blue dress is very flattering. Brings out your eyes beautifully." The office space was designed to impress and intimidate. Rich mahogany paneling covered the walls, and expensive Persian rugs decorated the floors. Robert's desk was massive, positioned to face anyone entering the room from a position of power. But what struck me most was how isolated the space felt. The windows faced an alley rather than the street, and the thick walls seemed to muffle any sound from the outside world. "Now then," Robert said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Let me explain what I have in mind for your role in our operations." What followed was 2 hours of the most psychologically torturous experience of my life up to that point. Robert had prepared what appeared to be legitimate business materials: client lists, correspondence templates, event planning documents. But woven throughout this facade of professional responsibility was a systematic campaign to normalize increasingly inappropriate behavior. He started by moving his chair closer to mine, ostensibly to better show me the documents we were reviewing. His leg pressed against mine as we sat side by side, and when I tried to shift away, he simply moved closer, maintaining the contact while continuing to discuss business matters in a perfectly professional tone. "You see, Patricia," he said, his hand resting on my knee as he pointed to something on the page in front of us. "Client relationships in this business are built on trust and personal connection. Wives play a crucial role in establishing that trust." His hand remained on my knee as he spoke, his thumb making small circles through the fabric of my dress. When I tried to remove it, Robert simply increased the pressure slightly and continued talking as if nothing had happened. "Some of our most important clients prefer to discuss business in social settings, dinner parties, weekend gatherings, private meetings. They need to feel comfortable with the entire family, not just the technical staff." The message was becoming clear. Robert was positioning my participation in these business relationships as essential to David's success, while simultaneously establishing physical contact as a normal part of our working relationship. Every time I tried to create boundaries, he would redirect the conversation back to David's career prospects and my responsibility as a Mitchell family wife. The most disturbing moment came when Robert stood up to retrieve a file from a cabinet across the room. Instead of returning to his own chair, he sat on the arm of mine, his body pressed against my shoulder as he opened the file across both our laps. "This particular client," he said, his breath warm against my ear, "is very important to our future expansion plans. His wife and I have developed a very close working relationship over the years." The implication was unmistakable. Robert was telling me that inappropriate relationships with clients' wives were not only acceptable, but profitable for the company. He was normalizing the idea that business success sometimes required personal sacrifices that went far beyond professional courtesy. When I tried to stand up, Robert's hand on my shoulder gently but firmly pushed me back down. "We're not finished yet, Patricia," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "There are several more clients we need to discuss, and some specific strategies I want you to understand." For the next hour, Robert systematically broke down every psychological barrier I had left. He described scenarios where I would be expected to entertain clients alone while David was traveling. He outlined social events where my role would be to make powerful men feel welcomed and appreciated. Most disturbingly, he made it clear that my success in these roles would directly impact David's advancement within the company. "You want David to eventually take over the company, don't you?" Robert asked, his hand now resting on my thigh. "You want him to inherit the legacy that 3 generations of Mitchell men have built? That level of responsibility requires sacrifices from the entire family, Patricia. Everyone has to contribute in their own way." When I finally found the courage to ask directly what he expected from me, Robert's mask slipped entirely. His hand moved higher on my thigh, and his voice dropped to a whisper that made my skin crawl. "I expect complete loyalty, Patricia, complete cooperation, and complete discretion." He leaned closer, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. "David doesn't need to know about the details of your business responsibilities. Some aspects of corporate relationships are too complex for the technical minds to understand. This will be our special project, yours and mine." I managed to escape that day by claiming a sudden illness, promising to return the following week to continue our business planning. But as I drove home through the Pittsburgh traffic, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer, I knew that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Robert had made his intentions crystal clear, and I had allowed myself to be trapped in a situation where resistance seemed impossible. The worst part was waiting for David to come home that evening. He was so excited to hear about my first day working with his father, so proud that Robert had chosen me for this special role. "How did it go?" he asked the moment he walked through the door. "Dad called me this afternoon and said you were doing wonderfully, that you have exactly the kind of sophistication he needs for client relations." I forced a smile and gave vague, positive responses about learning the business and understanding client needs. But inside, I was screaming. Robert had already spoken to David, already established the narrative that our meeting had been successful and productive. If I tried to contradict that story now, whose word would David believe? That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake planning my escape from the trap Robert had constructed. I considered telling David everything, but I couldn't find words to explain the psychological manipulation without sounding delusional. I thought about quitting my new business role, but Robert had made it clear that such resistance would harm David's career prospects. Most desperately, I considered leaving entirely, packing my things and disappearing before the situation could escalate further. But where could I go? I had no independent financial resources, no family nearby who could help, and no friends who would understand the complexity of the situation. This was 1974, and wives who abandoned their families were ostracized by society, especially when they couldn't provide compelling reasons for their actions. The following week brought a new level of psychological warfare. Robert began calling our house in the evenings when David was home, ostensibly to discuss business matters but actually to reinforce his control over my daily life. "I hope Patricia is preparing for our meeting Thursday," he would say loud enough for David to hear. "We have some very important client relationships to discuss." These calls served multiple purposes. They reminded me constantly of my obligation to return to his office. They established in David's mind that these meetings were regular, important business activities, and they demonstrated Robert's ability to invade our private time whenever he chose. But most insidiously, Robert began sending me gifts that arrived during the day while David was at work. A book about business etiquette, a silk scarf that he claimed would be appropriate for client meetings, a bottle of expensive perfume with a note suggesting that presentation is crucial in client relations. Each gift came with a card signed, "Looking forward to our continued collaboration, R. M." The messages seemed innocent enough that I couldn't object to them, but their real meaning was perfectly clear to me. Robert was marking his territory, establishing a pattern of special attention that would become increasingly difficult to explain if David ever questioned it. The psychological pressure became so intense that I began having panic attacks. I would wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air, convinced that Robert was in our house. I started checking and rechecking the locks on our doors, jumping at every unexpected sound. My weight loss accelerated to the point where my clothes hung loosely on my frame. David noticed my deteriorating condition, but attributed it to the stress of my new business responsibilities. "Maybe Dad is pushing you too hard too fast," he said. One evening, stroking my hair as I lay with my head in his lap, "I could talk to him about scaling back your involvement until you're more comfortable with the work." The irony was devastating. David's loving concern for my well-being was exactly what Robert was counting on to keep me silent. If I allowed David to intervene on my behalf, Robert would know that I had complained about our business relationship, and the consequences for David's career would be swift and brutal. "No," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I just need time to adjust. Your father is being very patient with me. I don't want to seem ungrateful or incapable." David smiled and kissed the top of my head. "You're incredible, Patricia. Dad is lucky to have someone so dedicated working with him." As October approached, I realized that I was living in a nightmare of my own making. My attempts to protect David had trapped me in an escalating situation that I couldn't escape without destroying the very person I was trying to protect. Robert had constructed the perfect psychological prison, using my love for my husband as the bars that kept me contained. I had no way of knowing that the situation was about to change dramatically, that external forces were already moving to reshape everything I thought I understood about Robert Mitchell and the power he wielded. The trap that seemed so inescapable was about to spring on someone else entirely, and the revelation would shatter not just my understanding of my father-in-law, but everything I believed about the man I had married. October 1974 brought an unexpected development that would change everything, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time. David came home from work one evening with news that should have been exciting, but instead filled me with a strange sense of foreboding. "Dad wants to send me to Germany," he announced, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie. "There's a steel processing plant in Düsseldorf that's pioneering new techniques we want to implement here. It would be a 6-week assignment, maybe longer if the negotiations go well." My heart stopped. 6 weeks alone with Robert escalating his campaign would be psychological torture beyond anything I could endure. But I couldn't voice my terror without explaining why the thought of David's absence filled me with such dread. 6 weeks is a long time, I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "When would you leave?" "That's the thing," David said, pulling me into his arms. "Dad wants me to go next month, right after the annual company retreat. He says it's the perfect timing because production will be slower in November, and I can take as long as needed to really understand their processes." The company retreat. I had forgotten about Mitchell Steel Works' annual weekend gathering at a luxury resort in the Pocono Mountains. It was a tradition Robert had established years earlier, combining business planning with team-building activities for key employees and their families. This year's retreat was scheduled for the last weekend in October, just 2 weeks away. He also mentioned something else, David continued, his voice taking on a note of pride mixed with nervousness. "Dad wants to make an announcement about succession planning at the retreat. He's thinking about officially naming me as his heir apparent, putting it in writing for the board and the key investors." This should have been wonderful news, the culmination of everything David had worked toward. But I felt only a cold dread settling in my stomach. Robert was accelerating his timeline, and I suspected his plans for me were connected to David's upcoming promotion and subsequent absence in Germany. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and mounting anxiety. Robert called daily, with details about the retreat, ostensibly to coordinate logistics, but actually to remind me constantly of his presence in our lives. "I've arranged for you and David to have the presidential suite," he told me during one call while David was at work. "It has a beautiful view of the lake and a private balcony. Very romantic." His voice carried implications that made my skin crawl. I was beginning to understand that the retreat weekend was going to be Robert's opportunity to force the confrontation he had been building toward for months. Eleanor, David's stepmother, called a few days before the retreat, with what seemed like innocent questions about my wardrobe. "Robert mentioned that there will be several important investors attending," she said. "He wants to make sure you feel confident and appropriately dressed for the formal dinner Saturday night." Eleanor had always been kind to me, but there was something different in her tone during this conversation, a tension I couldn't quite identify. When I mentioned that I planned to wear a navy blue cocktail dress I had worn to previous company events, Eleanor paused for a long moment. "Actually, dear," she said finally, "Robert specifically asked me to take you shopping for something new. He said this weekend is particularly important for David's future, and he wants everything to be perfect. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon?" The shopping trip with Eleanor was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. She drove me to an expensive boutique in downtown Pittsburgh, the kind of place where I had never shopped before our marriage. The saleswoman clearly knew Eleanor well and had apparently been expecting us. "Mr. Mitchell called ahead," the woman explained, leading us to a private fitting room. "He described exactly what he had in mind. Something elegant but not too conservative, sophisticated but with a touch of accessibility." The way she said that last word made me uncomfortable, but Eleanor seemed to understand perfectly what Robert wanted. She selected 3 dresses for me to try on, each more form-fitting and revealing than anything I would normally choose. When I expressed hesitation about the necklines and hemlines, Eleanor's expression became strangely distant. "Robert has very specific ideas about presentation," she said quietly. "It's easier for everyone if we simply follow his preferences." There was something resigned and almost sad in her voice that I didn't understand at the time. Looking back, I realized that Eleanor was trying to warn me in the only way she could, preparing me for what Robert had planned while being careful not to voice any direct accusations that could be traced back to her. The dress we finally selected was beautiful but inappropriate for a family business event. Black silk with a plunging neckline and a hemline that ended well above my knees. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I looked sophisticated and alluring, but not like David's wife. I looked like someone Robert Mitchell would choose for his own purposes. "Perfect," Eleanor said, but there were tears in her eyes that she quickly wiped away. "You look absolutely perfect." On the drive to the resort that Friday afternoon, David was more excited than I had seen him in months. He talked constantly about the business opportunities the weekend would present, the important people he would meet, and the speech his father had asked him to prepare about his vision for the company's future. "This is it, Patricia," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand as we drove through the Pennsylvania countryside. "This is the moment we've been working toward since college. Dad is finally ready to trust me with the family legacy." The resort was magnificent, nestled in the mountains with views that took your breath away. Our suite was indeed impressive, with a king-size bed, a sitting area with a fireplace, and French doors that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the lake. Under different circumstances, it would have been the perfect romantic getaway. Robert had thought of everything. There were flowers in our room with a card welcoming us to a weekend that will change everything. A bottle of champagne was chilling in an ice bucket, along with a note suggesting that we celebrate the new chapter beginning in the Mitchell family story. The first evening's dinner was a casual affair, allowing everyone to arrive and settle in before the formal events began on Saturday. I wore a simple dress and tried to blend into the background, but I could feel Robert's eyes on me throughout the meal. He was charming and gracious to all the guests, the perfect host, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation in his behavior that made me nervous. After dinner, David was swept into conversations with investors and board members, leaving me to mingle with the other wives. These were women I had met at previous company events, but tonight their conversation seemed forced and artificial. Several of them made comments about how important this weekend was for David's future, and how crucial it was that everything go smoothly. "Robert has such high expectations," one of the wives said, giving me a meaningful look. "He's very particular about how the Mitchell family is represented." Another woman nodded in agreement. The wives play such an important role in these business relationships. Robert always says that success requires commitment from the entire family. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't the only one who had received specific instructions about this weekend. Robert had clearly orchestrated every detail, including the behavior and appearance of the family members attending. Saturday morning began with business meetings for the men and spa activities for the wives. I tried to relax during the massage and facial that had been arranged, but my mind kept racing with anxiety about what Robert had planned for the evening. The formal dinner was scheduled for 7 p.m., followed by dancing and what Robert had described as private conversations with key investors. When I returned to our suite to prepare for the evening, I found another surprise waiting for me. A jewelry box sat on the dresser with a note in Robert's handwriting. "For my beautiful daughter-in-law, a token of appreciation for all your contributions to the family business." Inside was a stunning diamond necklace, clearly expensive and completely inappropriate for a father-in-law to give to his son's wife. But David walked in just as I was reading the note, and his face lit up with pleasure and pride. "Dad mentioned he had a special gift for you," David said, taking the necklace from my trembling hands. "This must have cost a fortune. He really thinks of you as part of the family now." David fastened the necklace around my neck, his fingers gentle against my skin. In the mirror, I could see how the diamonds drew attention to the plunging neckline of the black dress, creating exactly the effect Robert had intended. I looked expensive, available, and completely unlike the conservative young teacher David had married. "You look incredible," David whispered, kissing my neck just above the diamond necklace. "I'm the luckiest man here tonight." The formal dinner was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Robert had arranged the seating so that I was positioned between two of the company's most important investors, elderly men who seemed charmed by my presence and eager to engage in conversation. David was seated at the head table with the other key executives, close enough to see me but too far away to hear the increasingly inappropriate comments the men beside me were making. Robert, of course, was directly across from me, watching every interaction with the satisfied expression of a chess master executing a complex strategy. When the investors complimented my appearance or made suggestive remarks about how lucky David was to have such a beautiful wife, Robert would smile and nod approvingly, encouraging their attention. The most disturbing moment came when one of the investors, emboldened by alcohol and Robert's obvious approval, placed his hand on my thigh under the table. When I tried to remove it, Robert caught my eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly, his expression making it clear that I was expected to tolerate this behavior. "Business relationships require flexibility," Robert had told me during one of our office meetings, and now I understood exactly what he had meant. I was expected to be accommodating to these powerful men, to make them feel welcomed and appreciated in ways that went far beyond professional courtesy. After dinner, as the group moved to the resort's ballroom for dancing and drinks, Robert finally made his move. He approached me while David was engaged in an animated discussion with several board members about the German expansion project. "Patricia, darling," Robert said, taking my arm possessively, "there are several investors who would like to meet you privately. Very important men who could significantly impact David's future with the company." His grip on my arm was firm enough to prevent escape, and his voice carried that familiar undertone of threat disguised as opportunity. "I've arranged for us to use the resort owner's private suite for these meetings. It's more comfortable than the public areas, and we can have more intimate conversations about business opportunities." The word intimate made my blood run cold, but before I could protest, Robert was guiding me across the ballroom toward a discreet exit. I looked back desperately for David, but he was completely absorbed in his business discussions, unaware that his wife was being led away by his father. The private suite was located in a separate wing of the resort, accessible only by a private elevator that required a special keycard. As we rode up in silence, Robert's hand remained on my arm, his thumb making small circles against my skin in a gesture that was meant to be soothing but felt predatory. "Now, Patricia," Robert said as the elevator doors opened, "I want you to understand how important this evening is for David's future. The men you're about to meet control billions of dollars in investment capital. Their approval could make David one of the most powerful men in the steel industry." The suite was elegantly appointed, but felt like a trap. Heavy curtains blocked. The windows and the lighting was dim and intimate. A bar had been set up in one corner, and soft music played from hidden speakers. It looked like the setting for a seduction, not a business meeting. "There's just one thing I need to clarify before they arrive," Robert said, closing the door behind us and engaging what sounded like multiple locks. "These are men who appreciate beauty, Patricia. They expect certain courtesies from the women in their business circle." He moved closer to me, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "You want David to succeed, don't you? You want him to inherit everything I've built? Then you'll do whatever is necessary to secure these relationships." His hands reached for me, and in that moment, something inside me finally broke. All the months of psychological manipulation, all the careful boundary violations, all the threats, disguised as family loyalty, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "No," I said, stepping backward toward the door. "I won't do this. I won't let you destroy my marriage and my self-respect for your business deals." Robert's expression changed instantly, the charming mask falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "I don't think you understand the situation, Patricia," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "This isn't a request. This is how business is conducted at this level. David's future depends on your cooperation." When I reached for the door handle, I discovered what I should have expected. The locks were electronic and required the same key card that had brought us up in the elevator. Robert was holding that card and his smile was cold and triumphant. "Now then," he said, moving toward the bar, "let me pour you a drink to help you relax. The investors will be here soon, and I want you to be in the right frame of mind to make a good impression." That's when I realized that this had always been Robert's endgame. The months of psychological conditioning, the business partnership facade, the carefully orchestrated weekend, it had all been leading to this moment when he would finally force me into a situation I couldn't escape. But Robert Mitchell had made one crucial miscalculation. In focusing so intently on breaking down my resistance, he had failed to consider what would happen when a desperate woman finally had nothing left to lose. The drink Robert poured me remained untouched on the glass coffee table as I stood frozen, near the locked door, my mind racing through possible escape routes that didn't exist. The private suite felt smaller with each passing second, the elegant furniture now seeming like props in a carefully staged nightmare. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be, Patricia," Robert said, loosening his tie as he moved away from the bar. "These men will be here in 15 minutes, and I need you to be in the right mindset to make them feel welcomed." His words carried implications that made my stomach churn, but something had fundamentally shifted inside me during that moment of clarity at the door. The months of psychological manipulation had finally pushed me past fear into a territory I hadn't known existed, a place where survival instinct overrode everything else. "What men?" I demanded, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "You're lying. This was never about business meetings or investor relationships. This is about you wanting to assault me, and you've been building up to it for months." Robert's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. He wasn't accustomed to direct confrontation, especially from someone he had systematically broken down over time. "Assault is such an ugly word," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I had learned to hate. "This is about family loyalty, Patricia, about understanding your role in David's future success." But I was no longer listening to his justifications. Instead, I was studying the room with new eyes, looking for anything I could use to my advantage. The suite had a landline telephone on the desk near the window. If I could reach it and call the front desk, I might be able to get help before Robert could stop me. "David is going to be looking for me," I said, taking a small step toward the desk. "When I don't return to the ballroom, he'll come looking." Robert laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "David is exactly where I want him to be, downstairs discussing the details of his promotion with the board members. They've been instructed to keep him occupied for at least an hour. He won't even notice you're gone." The casual way Robert described manipulating his own son was perhaps the most chilling revelation yet. This wasn't just about his desire to abuse me. It was about his complete control over every aspect of our lives, including David's perception of reality. I made my move toward the telephone, but Robert was faster than I expected for a man his age. He intercepted me halfway across the room, grabbing my wrist with enough force to leave marks. "I don't think so," he said, his voice losing all pretense of charm. "We're going to do this my way, Patricia. You can make it easy on yourself, or you can make it difficult, but it's going to happen." That's when I heard it, a sound that changed everything. The electronic lock on the door was disengaging, followed by the quiet whoosh of the door opening. Robert's grip on my wrist loosened slightly as we both turned toward the entrance, expecting to see the investors he claimed were coming. Instead, Eleanor Mitchell stepped into the room, her face pale but determined. She was carrying a small recording device in one hand and what appeared to be a master keycard in the other. Behind her, to my complete shock, was David. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Eleanor, what are you doing here? And David, you should be downstairs with the board members." "The board meeting ended 20 minutes ago," David said, his voice strangely calm. "I went looking for Patricia and couldn't find her anywhere. Eleanor offered to help me search." Eleanor held up the recording device, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "I've been recording your conversations with Patricia for the past 3 weeks," she said. "Every phone call to the house, every business meeting in your downtown office. I know exactly what you've been doing to this poor girl." The color drained from Robert's face as the implications of Eleanor's revelation sank in. "You don't understand," he said, releasing my wrist and stepping backward. "This is business. Complex business relationships that require—" "Stop," David interrupted, his voice cutting through his father's excuses like a blade. "Just stop talking." I had never seen David like this before. His face was completely expressionless, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. When he looked at me, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart break. The dawning realization that his wife had been suffering while he remained obliviously focused on his career. "How long?" he asked, his question directed at me, but his eyes never leaving his father's face. "Since the wedding," I whispered, the words finally finding their way out after months of silence. It started small, inappropriate comments, touching that lasted too long. But it's been escalating for months. Eleanor moved closer to us, keeping the recording device prominently displayed. I started suspecting something when Robert began, insisting that Patricia work on these mysterious business projects. When I saw how terrified she looked at family gatherings, I knew I had to do something. "You've been spying on me?" Robert demanded, his voice rising as he struggled to regain control of the situation. "Recording private conversations in my own home?" "Your conversations with Patricia weren't private," Eleanor replied with surprising steel in her voice. "They were harassment. And after what you put David's mother through before she died, I swore I would never let you hurt another woman in this family." The room fell silent again as the weight of Eleanor's words settled over us. David's mother had died in a car accident when he was 8 years old, or so I had always been told. The implication in Eleanor's statement suggested a very different story. "What do you mean, what he put my mother through?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor looked at Robert with something approaching hatred. "Tell him," she said. "Tell him the truth about Margaret, or I will." Robert's facade of control finally cracked completely. "Eleanor, you don't know what you're talking about. Margaret's accident was— Margaret didn't die in an accident," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She died by suicide, David. She drove her car into that tree on purpose because she couldn't live with what your father was doing to her anymore." The silence that followed Eleanor's revelation was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a terrible understanding that seemed to age him years in mere seconds. "You're lying," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad told me she lost control of the car in the rain." "I have her journal," Eleanor said quietly. "I've kept it all these years, hoping I would never need it. Margaret documented everything: the affairs, the psychological abuse, the threats he made when she tried to leave. She was planning to divorce him and take you with her when she died." Robert lunged toward Eleanor, presumably to grab the recording device or stop her from saying anything more, but David moved with surprising speed to block his path. For the first time in my life, I saw my gentle, intellectual husband as the son of a steelworker, strong, determined, and completely unmoved by his father's desperation. "Don't," David said, his voice carrying a warning that made Robert stop in his tracks. "Don't say another word, and don't take another step toward any of us." The transformation in David was remarkable and terrifying. The devoted son who had spent his entire adult life trying to earn his father's approval was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was capable of violence if pushed too far. "David, you have to understand," Robert said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I had never heard before. "Everything I've done has been for you, for your future. The business, the connections, even this weekend. It's all been about securing your place in the industry." "By abusing my wife?" David asked, his voice rising with each word. "By terrorizing the woman I love? By continuing the same pattern that killed my mother?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Robert's face went through a series of micro-expressions as he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The charm, the manipulation, the psychological control he had wielded for decades, none of it was working anymore. "You don't understand the pressures of building a business empire," Robert said, making one last desperate attempt to justify his actions. "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Sometimes family members have to contribute in ways that—" David hit him. I had never seen my husband throw a punch before, had never imagined the quiet engineer I married was capable of physical violence. But the sound of David's fist connecting with his father's jaw echoed through the suite like a gunshot, followed by Robert crashing backward into the bar cart. 26 years, David said, standing over his father's fallen form. 26 years I've worshipped you. 26 years I've tried to be worthy of the Mitchell name. And you've been a monster the entire time." Robert struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip, but the fight had gone out of him. The mask of respectability and paternal authority had been completely stripped away, leaving only a broken old man who had finally been exposed for what he truly was. Eleanor moved to my side, wrapping her arm around my shoulders in a gesture of support that I desperately needed. "We have enough evidence to destroy him," she said quietly. "The recordings, Margaret's journal, and now Patricia's testimony. Robert Mitchell's reign of terror is over." But David wasn't finished. He moved to the telephone on the desk and began dialing, his movements sharp and decisive. "Who are you calling?" I asked. "The police," David replied without hesitation. "And then the board of directors. And then every newspaper and business journal that's ever written a positive story about Mitchell Steelworks." The word police seemed to galvanize Robert into one final act of desperation. "You'll destroy everything," he pleaded with his son. "The company, the family name, your own future. Everything we've built will be gone." David hung up the phone and turned to face his father with an expression of complete disgust. "Everything we've built was built on lies and abuse. I'd rather lose it all than spend another day pretending to respect a man who drove my mother to suicide and terrorized my wife." The police arrived within 15 minutes, followed shortly by hotel security and several very confused board members who had been summoned by David's phone calls. As Robert was led away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to salvage his reputation. "This is all a misunderstanding," he called out to the assembled crowd of business associates and hotel staff. "Family disputes blown out of proportion. You all know me. You know what kind of man I am." But Eleanor held up the recording device and Margaret's journal, and David stood beside me with his arm around my waist, presenting a united front that made Robert's protests sound hollow and desperate. "Yes," Eleanor said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We all know exactly what kind of man you are." As the elevator doors closed on Robert Mitchell for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the absence of fear. The psychological weight that had been crushing me since our wedding day was finally lifting, replaced by something I was only beginning to recognize as hope. But even as I celebrated this moment of liberation, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of our journey was just beginning. Destroying the monster was only the first step. Now we had to figure out how to rebuild our lives from the wreckage he had left behind. The ride back to Millbrook the following morning was unlike any journey David and I had ever taken together. We drove in almost complete silence, both of us lost in thoughts too complex and painful to voice. The man sitting beside me was my husband, but he was also a stranger, someone whose entire understanding of his life and family had been shattered. In the space of a single evening, Eleanor had chosen to stay at the resort an extra day to handle the legal formalities and coordinate with the police investigation. Before we left, she had pressed Margaret's journal into David's hands with a gentleness that spoke to decades of carrying this terrible secret. "I should have acted sooner," she had whispered to me as we said goodbye. "I should have protected you the way I failed to protect Margaret. But I was so afraid of destroying David's relationship with his father that I waited too long." Her guilt was palpable, but I understood her impossible position. How do you tell a man that his father is a monster? How do you shatter someone's entire worldview when they're not ready to hear the truth? When we finally reached our house, David parked in the driveway but made no move to get out of the car. He sat gripping the steering wheel, staring at our front door as if it belonged to someone else's life. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he said finally, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. "The way you started losing weight, how nervous you became around family gatherings, the excuses you made to avoid spending time with Dad. God, Patricia, how could I have been so blind?" I reached over and placed my hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You weren't blind, David. You were manipulated just as much as I was. Robert spent your entire life conditioning you to trust him completely, to see him as infallible. That kind of psychological control doesn't break easily. But you're my wife," he said, turning to look at me with eyes full of anguish. "I'm supposed to protect you, to notice when you're in pain." Instead, I was so focused on impressing him, on earning his approval, that I let him terrorize the woman I love. The raw pain in David's voice broke something open inside me that I had been keeping, carefully contained. All the months of fear and isolation, all the sleepless nights and panic attacks, all the times I had wanted to scream the truth but couldn't find the words, it all came pouring out in tears that felt like they would never stop. David pulled me into his arms right there in the car, and we cried together for everything we had lost, our innocence, our trust, our belief that the people who were supposed to love us would always keep us safe. We cried for David's mother, whose desperate act of self-destruction had finally made sense. And we cried for the marriage we would have to rebuild from scratch, brick by painful brick. The next few days passed in a surreal haze of phone calls, legal consultations, and newspaper reporters who had somehow gotten hold of the story. The scandal of Robert Mitchell's arrest had sent shockwaves through the Pennsylvania business community, and the details that emerged during the investigation painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning decades. 3 other women came forward, with similar stories about Robert's behavior: a secretary from the 1960s who had been fired when she refused his advances, a client's wife who had endured years of harassment during business dinners, and most heartbreakingly, a young factory worker who had been assaulted in 1971 but had been too afraid to report it at the time. Each revelation felt like another weight lifting from my shoulders, while simultaneously adding to David's burden of guilt and horror. The father he had idolized his entire life had been a serial predator, and David was struggling to reconcile that reality with 26 years of carefully constructed memories. I keep trying to remember if there were moments when I saw the real him, David told me one evening as we sat in our living room, Margaret's journal open between us. But he was so good at compartmentalizing, at being the perfect father when I was around, and the monster when I wasn't. Margaret's journal was perhaps the most devastating evidence of Robert's true nature. Her entries, written in careful cursive handwriting, documented years of psychological and physical abuse that had escalated after David's birth. She had stayed in the marriage primarily to protect her son, but Robert's threats to take David away if she ever left had trapped her in an impossible situation. The final entries, written just days before her death, revealed a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. "I can't protect David from the truth forever," she had written. "He's starting to ask questions about why Daddy makes Mommy cry. I won't let him grow up thinking this is how men are supposed to treat women. If I can't escape, at least I can make sure David never becomes like his father." Reading those words, David broke down completely. The strong, composed man who had confronted his father and called the police dissolved into someone who looked lost and broken. "She died believing she was protecting me," he sobbed. "But all she did was leave me alone with him for 18 more years." The legal proceedings moved surprisingly quickly. Robert's lawyer, a longtime family friend, withdrew from the case when the evidence became overwhelming. The recordings Eleanor had made, combined with the testimony of multiple victims and the historical documentation in Margaret's journal, created an airtight case that even Robert's money and connections couldn't overcome. But the personal reckoning was much more complicated than the legal one. David struggled with a guilt that went far beyond his failure to protect me. He was haunted by the realization that his entire identity had been shaped by a man who was fundamentally evil, and he questioned everything from his career choices to his basic understanding of right and wrong. "What if I'm like him?" he asked me one night, the question that had been haunting him finally voiced. "What if there's something in me, some genetic predisposition toward violence or manipulation? How can you even stand to be in the same room with me, knowing where I come from?" The question revealed how deeply Robert's betrayal had wounded David's sense of self. He was struggling not just with the loss of a father figure, but with fundamental questions about his own character and potential for darkness. "You are nothing like him," I said firmly, taking his face in my hands and forcing him to meet my eyes. "Nothing. You've spent the last week agonizing over ways you could have better protected me. Robert spent months planning how to hurt me, The fact that you can't understand his mindset is proof that you don't share it. Slowly, painfully, we began the process of rebuilding our relationship. David insisted on couples counseling, despite the stigma attached to such things in 1974. "I don't care what people think," he said. "I need to understand how to be a better husband, and you need to heal from what he did to you." Our therapist, Dr. Susan Walsh, was a pioneering figure in trauma counseling who had recently begun working with victims of psychological abuse. She helped us understand that our healing would be a long process, complicated by the fact that we had both been victims of Robert's manipulation in different ways. Abusers like Robert are experts at psychological warfare, Dr. Walsh explained during one of our sessions. They isolate their victims not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. They make you doubt your own perceptions, your own worth, your own ability to survive without them. Recovery means learning to trust yourself again. For me, that meant slowly rebuilding my sense of agency and self-worth. The months of psychological conditioning had left me second-guessing every decision, every emotion, every instinct. I had to relearn how to trust my own judgment, how to speak up when something made me uncomfortable, how to believe that my feelings and concerns were valid. For David, the challenge was different, but equally complex. He had to examine every aspect of his relationship with his father, separating the genuine love and guidance from the manipulation and control. He had to forgive himself for being deceived by someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception. The most difficult conversation came 6 weeks after Robert's arrest, when David finally worked up the courage to ask me the question that had been tormenting him. "Did you ever think about leaving me?" he asked. "During all those months when you were suffering and I was oblivious, did you consider just disappearing?" The honesty he deserved was painful to give. "Yes," I admitted. "There were nights when I packed a suitcase and planned to leave in the morning. But I never could go through with it because I loved you too much to destroy your relationship with your father based on something I couldn't prove." David was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the sacrifice I had made and the impossible position Robert had put me in. "I'm so sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry you felt like you had to choose between protecting me and protecting yourself. I'm sorry my love for him meant more to me than your fear of him." "You didn't know," I replied. "Neither of us knew who he really was. The business implications of Robert's crimes were as complicated as the personal ones." Mitchell Steele. Works was in chaos, with clients fleeing and employees uncertain about their futures. David, as the presumptive heir, found himself inheriting not a thriving company, but a scandal-ridden enterprise that might not survive the public relations disaster. "I could try to salvage it," David told me during one of our evening conversations. "Change the name, bring in new management, restructure everything. It would take years, but it might be possible." "Or?" I asked, sensing there was an alternative he was considering. "Or we could start over completely. Sell everything, take whatever money we can get, and build something new somewhere else. Something that has nothing to do with the Mitchell name or legacy." The decision we ultimately made surprised everyone, including ourselves. David chose to liquidate Mitchell Steelworks entirely, selling the assets to a competitor and using the proceeds to establish a fund for victims of workplace abuse. We kept only enough money to start fresh, somewhere far from the shadow of Robert's crimes. "I won't profit from what he built through intimidation and abuse," David announced at the final board meeting. "And I won't spend the rest of my life trying to redeem a name that should be forgotten." The reaction from the business community was mixed. Some praised David's integrity and courage, while others questioned his judgment in destroying a family legacy that had provided jobs for hundreds of people. But David was unmoved by the criticism. "Let them question my judgment," he said. "I've spent my entire life making decisions based on what Robert Mitchell would approve of. From now on, I'm making decisions based on what Margaret Mitchell's son believes is right." By the spring of 1975, we were ready to begin the next chapter of our lives. We had sold our house in Millbrook and made plans to move to Oregon, where David had been offered a position with a small engineering firm that specialized in renewable energy projects. It was a new field, one that aligned with our shared desire to build something positive and forward-looking. Eleanor chose to come with us, leaving behind the wealthy widow's life she could have maintained in Pennsylvania. "I've spent too many years being complicit in Robert's crimes through my silence," she explained. "I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends." The night before we left Pennsylvania, David and I drove to the cemetery where his mother was buried. We brought flowers and Margaret's journal, which David had decided to leave at her graveside as a symbol of the truth finally being acknowledged. "I wish I could have saved you," David whispered to the headstone. "I wish I could have been brave, enough to see what was happening and strong enough to stop it." As we stood there in the gathering dusk, I realized that we were not just saying goodbye to Margaret, but to the people we had been before, learning the truth about Robert Mitchell, the naive young couple who had believed that love and good intentions were enough to protect them from evil, was gone forever. But in their place stood two people who had survived something terrible and emerged with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. We were scarred, but we were also stronger. We were wiser, but we were also more compassionate. We had lost our innocence, but we had gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that we could face the worst truths about the people we loved and still choose to love each other. 30 years later, as I sit here at age 76, people often ask me what the unthinkable thing was that my husband did when I finally told him about his father's abuse. They expect me to describe the dramatic confrontation at the resort, or David's decision to have his father arrested, or perhaps his choice to destroy the family business rather than profit from Robert's crimes. But the truly unthinkable thing David did was something that happened much later, something so unexpected and profound that it changed not just our lives, but the lives of countless other families facing similar horrors. Our new life in Oregon began quietly enough. David threw himself into his work with the renewable energy company, channeling his engineering expertise into projects that felt meaningful and forward-looking. I returned to teaching, this time working with high school students who challenged me in ways that helped rebuild my confidence and sense of purpose. Eleanor became the grandmother figure our children, yes, children, would later adore, though it took years before we felt emotionally ready to start a family. For the first few years, we focused simply on healing and building a normal life together. We rarely spoke about Pennsylvania or the Mitchell name. It was as if we had agreed to bury that part of our past so completely that it might eventually cease to exist. But trauma, I learned, doesn't disappear simply because you relocate geographically. It lives in your body, in your reactions, in the ways you instinctively flinch when someone approaches from behind, or the panic that rises when you hear a particular tone of voice. Both David and I carried invisible scars that manifested in unexpected ways throughout our daily lives. For me, the triggers were often subtle: a man standing too close in line at the grocery store, the sound of footsteps behind me when I walked, alone, or even certain cologne scents that would instantly transport me back to those terrifying moments in Robert's office. I learned to manage these reactions, but they never completely disappeared. David's trauma was different, but equally persistent. He struggled with what psychologists now recognize as secondary trauma, the deep psychological wounds that come from discovering that someone you loved and trusted was capable of unthinkable evil. He questioned every memory of his childhood, wondering what signs he had missed and what other victims his blindness might have enabled. But it was in 1982, 7 years after we had left Pennsylvania, that David made the decision that would ultimately define the rest of our lives together. By then, we had 2 young children, Michael, age 4, and Sarah, age 2. And David had been promoted to a senior engineering position with excellent prospects for advancement. One evening, as he was helping Michael with a simple math problem, at our kitchen table, our son made an innocent comment that stopped David cold. "Daddy," Michael said, "why don't we ever visit Grandpa like Tommy visits his grandpa?" David's face went white, and I saw him struggle with how to answer. We had told the children that David's father had died, a fiction that seemed kinder than the truth. But Michael's question forced David to confront something he had been avoiding, the realization that our children would grow up without understanding the family history that had shaped their parents' lives. That night, after the children were asleep, David came to me with a proposal that seemed impossible. "I want to go back," he said. "Not to live, but to testify." I didn't understand what he meant at first. Robert had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The legal case was closed, and Robert himself was reportedly in poor health, serving his time in a minimum security facility for white-collar criminals. "There's going to be a parole hearing next year," David explained. "Eleanor sent me the notification. Robert's lawyers are arguing that he's a model prisoner who poses no threat to society, and they're pushing for early release after serving only 8 years. The thought of Robert being freed early made my blood run cold, but I still didn't understand what David was proposing. "What do you mean by going back to testify?" I asked. "I want to speak at the parole hearing," David said, his voice gaining strength as he outlined his plan. "I want to tell them exactly what Robert Mitchell did to our family. Not just to you, but to my mother, to me, to everyone whose lives he destroyed. I want to make sure they understand that his crimes weren't just business misconduct or personal indiscretions. They were systematic, deliberate, and part of a pattern that went on for decades." The idea terrified me. We had spent 7 years building a life free from Robert's shadow, and David was proposing that we willingly walk back into that darkness. But as he continued explaining his reasoning, I began to understand the deeper motivation behind his decision. "I've been thinking about Michael and Sarah," David said. "Someday, they're going to be old enough to understand what happened to our family. I want them to know that when their father finally learned the truth, he didn't just walk away and pretend it never happened. I want them to know that he fought, to make sure the man who hurt their mother and grandmother faced the full consequences of his actions." But David's plan went far beyond simply testifying at a parole hearing. Over the following weeks, he outlined a comprehensive campaign to ensure that Robert's story became a cautionary tale rather than a buried scandal. He contacted investigative journalists, reached out to victim advocacy groups, and began documenting not just Robert's crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. "Companies like Mitchell Steelworks don't exist in isolation," David explained to me as he worked late into the night, compiling evidence and reaching out to other victims. "They're supported by banks, suppliers, customers, and community leaders who chose to look the other way when the signs were there. I want to expose the entire network that enabled his behavior." The most ambitious part of David's plan involved establishing what he called the Margaret Mitchell Foundation, an organization dedicated to identifying and supporting victims of workplace abuse, particularly in family-owned businesses where traditional power structures made reporting nearly impossible. These kinds of crimes thrive in environments where victims feel isolated and powerless, David told the board of advisors he assembled for the foundation. "They continue because people like me, family members, employees, business partners, either don't see the signs or choose to ignore them because confronting the truth would be inconvenient." But here's where David did something that truly was unthinkable, something that went beyond anything I could have imagined when I first fell in love with that quiet engineering student. He decided to make our story public in the most comprehensive way possible. Working with a documentary filmmaker and investigative journalist, David helped produce a feature-length film about the Robert Mitchell case, using our real names and featuring extensive interviews with both of us. The film, titled The Family Business, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 1984 and went on to win several awards for its unflinching examination of abuse of power in corporate America. Watching ourselves on screen, seeing our most painful memories transformed into a public narrative was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. But David's reasoning was unshakable. If we keep these stories private, they become shameful secrets. If we make them public, they become cautionary tales that might prevent other families from going through what we went through. The documentary's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Victim advocacy groups used it in their training programs. Business schools began incorporating it into their ethics curricula. Most importantly, it inspired dozens of other victims to come forward with their own stories of abuse in family businesses and corporate environments. Robert's parole hearing in 1983 became a media spectacle, with victims, family members, and advocates testifying not just about his specific crimes, but about the broader pattern of abuse that his case represented. David's testimony was the most powerful, delivered with a composure and moral clarity that made headlines across the country. Robert Mitchell didn't just abuse women, David told the parole board. He abused the trust that families place in their leaders, the faith that employees have in their employers, and the assumption that success in business is correlated with moral character. Releasing him early would send a message that these crimes are somehow less serious than they actually are. Robert's parole was denied, and he ultimately served his full sentence, dying in prison in 1987 of a heart attack. But by then, David's advocacy work had grown into something much larger than a quest for personal justice. The Margaret Mitchell Foundation became a nationally recognized organization, helping to pass legislation that strengthened protections for workplace abuse victims and established new reporting mechanisms for crimes that occurred within family businesses. David left his engineering career to run the foundation full-time, transforming himself from a trauma victim into one of the country's most effective advocates for corporate accountability. But perhaps the most unthinkable thing of all was what happened in our marriage during this process. Instead of being destroyed by the public scrutiny and the constant reopening of old wounds, we became stronger. The shared mission gave us a way to transform our trauma into something meaningful, to ensure that our pain served a purpose beyond our own healing. Our children grew up understanding exactly what had happened to their family, but they also grew up seeing their parents as people who had faced unthinkable evil and chosen to fight back in the most public and comprehensive way possible. Michael became a prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, while Sarah became a therapist working with trauma victims. Eleanor lived to see the Foundation's 10th anniversary in 1992, passing away peacefully at age 86 with the knowledge that her decision to record Robert's conversations had ultimately led to systemic changes that protected countless other families. Today, at 76, I serve on the Foundation's board of directors, while David, at 78, continues his advocacy work despite several health challenges. We've been married for 51 years, and people often comment on how strong our relationship appears despite everything we've been through. The truth is that surviving Robert Mitchell's abuse wasn't what made our marriage strong. It was David's decision to transform that survival into a mission that gave meaning to our suffering. When he chose to make our private trauma into a public crusade for justice, he was doing something that went against every instinct we had developed. During our years of hiding and healing, it was unthinkable that a quiet engineer would become a nationally recognized advocate. It was unthinkable that we would voluntarily subject ourselves to decades of media attention and public scrutiny. It was unthinkable that we would choose to relive our worst memories over and over again in service of strangers we would never meet. But perhaps most unthinkably of all, David chose to honor his mother's memory, not by protecting her secrets, but by ensuring that her story became a beacon of hope for other women trapped in similar circumstances. Margaret Mitchell died believing that silence was the only way to protect her son. Her son chose to prove that speaking the truth was the only way to protect everyone else's children. The Margaret Mitchell Foundation has now helped over 10,000 families deal with workplace abuse and corporate misconduct. The legislation we helped pass has been adopted in 37 states. The documentary about our story is still used in business schools and victim advocacy programs around the world. When people ask me what the unthinkable thing was that my husband did, I tell them this. When I finally found the courage to speak, my truth about his father's abuse, David didn't just believe me, support me, or even just seek justice for me. He made my truth into a bridge that thousands of other women have been able to cross from silence into safety. That is truly unthinkable. That one man's decision to face the worst truth about his family could create pathways to healing for so many others. That our private nightmare could become a public lighthouse, guiding other families away from the rocks that nearly destroyed us. Robert Mitchell spent decades using his power to hurt people and hide his crimes. David Mitchell has spent even more decades using his voice to heal people and expose similar crimes wherever they exist. That transformation, from the son of a monster into a champion for justice, is the most unthinkable thing of all. And it all began with a young woman finding the courage to say the words that would change everything. Your father is hurting me, and I need you to help me make it stop. Sometimes the most unthinkable thing is simply telling the truth and trusting that the people who love you will know what to do with it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.